Let me start off with a few words about the titles of this lecture. And you'll notice that the English title is Friend from a World Unseen, and the Japanese title is Minu yo no Tomo. And you would be justified in thinking that since I'm going to be speaking mainly in English, the English title is the real title of my talk. And the Japanese version is just there for the convenience of people who know Japanese, or just for decoration. Or maybe I was just showing that. But let me let you in on a little secret. The Japanese title is the real title of my talk. And it is the English title that is the translation. Minu yo no Tomo, or Friend from a World Unseen, is the title of an album of classical Japanese calligraphy, which is owned by the Idemitsu Museum in Tokyo. It's been designated a national treasure by the government of Japan and includes samples of calligraphy, including Teikas, from the 8th to the 16th centuries. I was quite struck when I heard this phrase, Minu yo no Tomo, which means a friend from a world that one has never seen. The phrase itself comes from Essays in Idleness, or Tsurezu Regusa, a 14th century collection of miscellaneous remarks and anecdotes by Yoshida Kenko, who was the Michel de Montaigne of medieval Japan. It moved me deeply when I first read it, and it is one of the books that led me to devote my life to the study of classical Japanese literature. Kenko writes, "To spread out a book by lamplight alone and to make friends with someone of a world one has never seen is a comfort without equal." And that's my translation, and all the translations you hear tonight are mine, so if there's something wrong with them, you can blame me for that. We can come to know, or think we know, people who died before we were born, or who live in a place, another place that we have never seen and we will never see. Writing allows us to transcend time and space in that way. Literary writing also enables us to feel, perhaps erroneously, perhaps not, that we can get to know someone from a vastly different time and place and even feel a spiritual affinity with them, akin to friendship. That has been my experience since I first became interested in traditional Japanese culture about 30 years ago. Reading, for me, is not a way of discovering myself. It's a way of discovering someone else, of seeing the world through their eyes. And so I'd like for an hour or so to take you into an unseen world. It's a fascinating world. There is no Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or cell phones. And by the way, please silence your ringtones about now. I'm not talking about 1995. That was also a great time, but it's a little earlier than that. And I'd like you to meet someone who is definitely not my friend. He was a colossal snob, and he would not, could not, ever befriend somebody who was not a fellow aristocrat. But it is someone with whom I have spent the past 20 years or so getting to know. His name is Fujiwara no Sadaie, also called Teika. My talk is divided into 3 parts. I'll tell you the parts to you as we go along so you know when I'm going to finish. First, we're going to find out who Teika was and what he did. Next, we're going to read some poems by him together. And third, we're going to see how he was treated by later generations, including our own. Here you see a portrait of Teika painting. It's actually in the collection of one branch of his descendants, the Reise family of Kyoto. And it's the most standard portrait of him. And it's said to be painted by this painter, Nobuzane, who actually knew him. We see Teika seated on a kind of dais, and he's wearing his courtier's uniform and his cap, and he's clutching what's called a shaku. It's a kind of baton that indicates his status. And it's kind of hard to see, but I'll leave it to you to figure out what this portrait might show about his personality. But above his head, you can see the second half of a poem that was written by Teika. The second half reads, "Katabutsuki no oshiki no mikawa." Does one mourn only the sinking moon? And the first half, which was missing, "When day breaks, autumn will be more than halfway gone." This is a celebrated verse by Teika in which he laments not just the passing of autumn as the harvest moon sets. I think last night we had the hunter's moon, but also the passing of his own life. And it's closely associated with him in the medieval period. I'd like to give you first an overview of Teika's 80-year lifetime, and then dive a little bit deeper into the various periods of his life and look at some incidents that stand out. We think of Teika today first and foremost as a poet, but he probably would have said, no, I'm a courtier. I'm here to serve the emperor, the retired emperor, and the ministers who serve them. His vocation, though, was Japanese poetry, and he was born into what you might call a poetic house, a lineage of poets who served the court and the country by writing, collecting, teaching, and judging Japanese poetry. For more than 500 years, Japanese emperors commissioned imperial anthologies of waka poetry. Waka poetry is the 31-syllable form. It's also called tanka, the short song, and it's a precursor of the 17-syllable haiku. From the 10th century Kokin Wakashu onward, there were 21 such imperial anthologies, and these texts have been very well preserved. Every poem in every chapter, in every anthology is around to this day. To have even one poem included in an imperial anthology meant that your name would be remembered forever. Teika not only had numerous poems included in multiple anthologies, but he was actually co-compiler of the 8th imperial anthology, the Shinko Kinshu, or the New Kokinshu, and that was in the early 13th century. And he was solo compiler, that was a great honor, of the 9th anthology, which followed it. Teika's poems are actually very well preserved in his own handwriting, and I'll show you one later. He lived about 800 years ago, and we have his poems in a text that he wrote himself. There are about 4,500 waka poems, a number of treatises on poetry. He wrote a fictional tale in his spare time set in Tang Dynasty China, and then there's his diary called Megetsuki, Record of the Brilliant Moon. The diary spans more than 50 years, and there's about a third of it that still survives, much of it, again, in Teika's own hand, and much of it remaining against all odds in the hands of his descendants, the Reizei family today. Let's dig a little bit more deeper into Teika's life. In 1162, he was born in the city that's now called Kyoto. Back then, they just called it Miyako, the capital. His father, Shunzei, was himself a famous poet and was also compiler of the 7th imperial anthology. His mother, to whom he was deeply attached and who passed away when he was only 31, was a former lady-in-waiting to an empress. So Teika had a pretty good head start. Teika came of age just as the warrior class was rising, politically, socially, and of course, militarily. The Genpei War, the great civil war between the Taira and the Minamoto clans that was chronicled in Tale of the Heike Monogatari, affected him and members of his family, although he claimed to feel otherwise. We might tend to think that the rise of the military during this period occurred at the exclusive expense of the aristocrats, but that is not entirely true. After the Minamoto won the Genpei War, they needed aristocrats to administer and control the court, and Teika, his patrons, and other courtiers were happy to oblige them. They had more influence under the Minamoto regime, actually, than they did under the Taira. In 1185, Teika was banned temporarily from the palace for striking a colleague who had provoked him. These things happen. After a few months, his father wrote a poem to the emperor, and he was restored to service. In 1193, his beloved mother died. Teika had been invited to submit poems to an important poetry contest. These people didn't just write poems, they had contests over who wrote the best poem, the better poem about a given topic, and they were judged, win, loss, draw, and they actually criticized each other's poems, almost as if it were a court case. And in the end, the judge makes the decision of which is the better poem and why. They're really fascinating. We have records for some of these, and they're really fabulous for telling us what people thought was good poetry back in the day. So he's invited to this mammoth poetry contest in 600 rounds. 600. 12 people writing 100 poems each, mashed into 600 rounds. And he should have said no. He was in mourning for his mother. But his father gave him a special order, participate in this contest, and he ordered him to join in. His father was also the judge. I think that helped too. This would prove to be a great turning point in his career, and it helped him lock in the patronage of the powerful Kujo house. In the 1190s, Teika's copy of the Tale of Genji was stolen. We know this because he writes about it later in his diary 20 years ago when he gets a new copy. So for 20 years, he doesn't have a copy of the Tale of Genji. It is, even today, the central work of Japanese literature. It was written by a court lady about the year 1000. It's about 1,200 pages long in English translation. Just because he didn't have a copy of the Tale of Genji, however, didn't prevent him from alluding to the tale in his poems. Okay? The students know this. You don't actually have to read the text to write about it. This period for Teika was a time of ups and downs. His patrons, the Kujo, were purged from the court, and Teika lost his political backing. On the other hand, he was building new alliances with another family by taking a second wife. He was recruited to compile the next imperial anthology and became closer to the retired Emperor Gotoba. But he lost his greatest teacher and supporter in 1202 when his father Shunzei died. They had a banquet celebrating the completion of the Shinko Kinshu, which actually wasn't complete, but that didn't prevent them from holding a party to celebrate the fact that it was supposed to be complete. But that was overshadowed by the absence of his father and others who died before the work was completed, like his patron, Yoshitsune. Still, Teika enjoyed the patronage of the new Emperor Juntoku, and he joined the ranks of the senior nobles in 1211 when he was appointed to the third rank. So the courtiers during Teika's time, generally people in his grade, entered the court hierarchy at junior 5th lower grade, and they worked their way up higher and higher. The highest rank was first rank. It was very hard to come by, but there was a real gap between 3rd and 4th, and being promoted to 3rd rank, joining the ranks of the senior nobles, or kugyo, was a big deal. He eventually did reach 2nd rank by the end of his life. Teika had many influential students whom he tutored in writing poetry, and one of them was the young shogun Minamoto no Sanetomo. We learned from Teika's diary again that there was a military official who was interfering with one of Teika's estates, whether wouldn't let the crop come in, or was taking taxes off the top, or something like that. And so Teika went into his archive. He took out his precious copy of the 8th century poetic anthology, Manyoshu, wrapped it up, and he sent it to the shogun with a little note. And we never heard of this military official again. The trouble stopped very quickly. So whoever thinks poetry is not powerful should reflect on this episode. Let's take a look at the last 20 years. Teika lived to be 80. In 1220, he had a falling out with retired Emperor Gotoba. The reason was that Gotoba demanded that Teika come to the palace for a poetry gathering in spring under the full moon. But the date happened to coincide with the anniversary of the death of his mother, who had passed away almost 30 years earlier. So Teika refused to attend. Gotoba insisted. Teika said no. Gotoba insisted again. Finally, Teika sent 2 poems, which instead of going himself, he sent these poems that subtly rebuked the emperor for his heartlessness. And for this, he was banned from the palace indefinitely. This is the worst thing that can happen to a courtier, to not be able to come into the imperial presence. It was also one of the best things that had ever happened to him, because the following year, Gotoba attempted to overthrow the shogunate and restore direct imperial rule during that time. The shogunate crushed his forces and sent him and his sons into exile. When the shogunate reorganized the court, Teika was at home. He was out of favor with Gotoba, and he was restored to his former positions and more. So it just goes to show, you never really know, do you? The end of Teika's life was a time of recouping losses. He got his rank back, he got his positions back, he got his access to the palace back, he got his copy of the Tale of Genji back. He was promoted to senior 2nd rank. He got the command to compile the 9th Imperial Waka Anthology. There was just one instruction: no poems by Gotoba should appear. And in 1233, he took Buddhist lay orders and retired from court, and he passed away a few years later. Talked about his diary a little bit, Meigetsuki. One of the reasons that I can tell you so much about him tonight, compared to other people of his time and either other times, is because he kept this diary in classical Chinese. He was biliterate for over 50 years, faithfully, since he was a young man until he was an old man. And much of it, as I said, is still extant. The diary itself has been designated a Japanese national treasure, and his descendants have a good portion of it. The rest of it is mainly in private collections and museums in Japan. Some of it is actually in pieces and scraps. He would keep them in scrolls that would each cover 1 month, but they're little bits and pieces. Because besides people who like to make calligraphy items, people who practiced the Japanese tea ceremony loved Teika's handwriting, his poetry, his personality, and they like to get a scrap of his handwriting and display it in the alcove as they gather to drink tea. There is, however, a 1 month long scroll from the diary. It's from the 9th month of 1226. It's in Teika's own hand, and it's actually held outside Japan. It's the only piece of the diary we know of that's held outside Japan. Harvard University owns it, and they received it as a donation from the collection of Donald and Mary Hyde. You can see Mary Hyde sitting there at the table on the right-hand side. They were two very famous American collectors of rare books who purchased it after they visited Japan in the early 1960s. It was a kind of souvenir. The Hydes mainly collected English books. I think they had Samuel Johnson's Teapot, which they also donated to Harvard at one point or another. And they didn't read Japanese, but they had a policy of collecting only the best books, and they had great informants. So they put together a small but really valuable collection, and they eventually gave this book to Harvard. This is what the entire scroll would look like if people had not cut pieces out of it over the years to show to their friends. The white parts are the parts that are actually missing from the Harvard scroll. I visited, I saw the scroll, and studied it, transcribed it, translated it, and I made this little reconstruction here. This is a close-up of the beginning of the scroll. You can see it says Kugatsu Dai, the 9th month. They were on a lunar calendar, so the 9th month was around mid-October to mid-November for us. It's actually right around this time. And you can tell by looking at it that this was not the fair final copy. It was a kind of draft or intermediate draft. And you can also see that it was written on the back of old documents. You can see ink that's actually leaking through the paper. And I saw it with my own eyes, and you can peek at it. And you can tell that he actually recycled old letters from around the same time as the diary, and he would use it that way. The handwriting is, it's quite messy, and you actually have to be something of a specialist to read it. This is not easy to read by any means. But I have a different point to make here. While we're looking here at Teika's handwriting and talking about how we get to know Teika, we can know Teika not just through what he writes in his poetry, his literary works, and his diary, that is to say the content, but also from the form of his handwriting. In many places, but in East Asia especially, handwriting is regarded as a kind of mirror to the soul. Look at this piece of handwriting. It's a typical sample of handwriting by Teika's father, Shunzei. So these are people who are father and son, half of the same DNA. You see how taut the lines are. They're thin, they're strong like wire, but they're also elegant. There's a balance of precision and mystery. And Shunzei was actually in his 80s when he wrote this. You can see that the lines are a little bit shaky in the 4th line from the left toward the bottom. The character No kind of misses it. But he's somebody he's still got it. Now take a look at Teika's handwriting. You can also tell that this was written when Teika was older. The characters are a little bit shaky. For example, in the 3rd line from the left toward the bottom, character Me. But it's different from Shunzei's handwriting, about the same age, father and son. Look at how clear it is. And notice the lack of ligatures or linkages between the characters. This is writing that's meant to be read clearly, without any mistakes. Teika was actually ashamed of the stylistic aspects of his calligraphy, but he was proud that he was an accurate copyist. This way of writing, this method that he perfected, is actually intended to minimize the errors that creep in inevitably when you copy by hand. It's like playing that game, telephone. One person tells another who tells another. When you copy a text by hand, you can actually introduce errors, you can miss lines very easily. He was an accurate copyist. And it's not just a practical style, a practical method. He has a style of his own. If you look at the great variations in the thickness of the line, between thin and thick, it is distinctive, and it is individualistic. Look at them side by side and see how different they are. You can recognize Teika's handwriting once you get a feel for it from a distance. And actually, over the centuries, combined with the readings of his poems and his diary, people have projected on Teika a certain kind of individualism, a certain stubbornness. And it didn't hurt that they could actually make out what he was writing in his texts. Okay, this is part 2. Let's read some poems by Teika. What was he doing with his brush when he wrote so clearly? The major topics in classical poetry, classical Japanese poetry, are love and the seasons, and of the seasons, especially spring and autumn. So I'd like to give you a glimpse of Teika's poetry by reading with you a poem about spring, a poem about autumn, and then finally a poem about love set in autumn because it's so timely right now. Haru no you no yume no ukihashi todae shite, mine ni wakaruru yokogumo no sora. On a spring night, the floating bridge of dreams snaps, parting from the peak, a rack of clouds in the sky. I find it very difficult to translate this phrase, yokogumo no sora, which I've called a rack of clouds in the sky. It means the sky in which the clouds are not round and puffy, but they're thin and they're stretched out. They're literally sideways clouds. And I looked up this phrase in a Japanese dictionary. I was hoping that I would get the scientific name for the cloud. But they just sent me to another poetic term, tanabikakumo, which means clouds that are stretched out like shells. And that doesn't work in English either. It's a glorious image, it's great, but it's hard to render elegantly. So I left out the sideways part. The spring nights in Japanese poetry are noted for their brevity. Of course, summer nights are the shortest, but it's in spring when we start to feel that the nights are shorter. And it's also the season most closely associated with love. And so poets write about wishing the nights were longer and regretting their brevity. In this poem, the speaker seems to be wakening suddenly from a dream. Maybe it was a dream about love. Perhaps the day is breaking a few minutes earlier than it did the previous day, and it catches him or her by surprise. That feeling of waking from a dream, you don't know where you are, you don't know who you are sometimes. It's a feeling of loss, of slipping, and disorientation. The metaphor for this feeling is the floating bridge. It's not a solid bridge, stone bridge made of an arch that spans pillars that are planted firmly into either bank of a river, or even a modern suspension bridge that's hung from pillars that are sunk deeply into the riverbed itself. No, this is just a floating bridge. It's made of maybe rafts that were tied together to each other and then fastened to a tree or a pole on either shore. It's inherently fragile, it's inherently flimsy. But I have to tell you, if you came here tonight from the east side, you might have driven over the longest floating bridge in the world, the 520 Bridge, which actually just rests on concrete pontoons that are floating on Lake Washington. And I have to tell you, I sometimes think about this poem across the bridge. Various elusive sources have been suggested for this poem. For example, it might draw upon a tale of the goddess of Mount Wu, who visited a Chinese emperor in his dream, in a story that appears in classical Chinese poetry, the Wenxuan, the Monzun. And this phrase, the floating bridge of dreams, is actually also the name of the last chapter of the Tale of Genji. The chapter and the Tale of Genji itself end in mid-sentence, in mid-thought. There's no sort of double wedding like in Jane Austen, no cathartic wrapping up of the plot. It just breaks off, okay? Life is like that, it ends. Like many poems of Teika's age, this poem ends on a noun. And that's not easy to do in Japanese without creating what we would call in English a sentence fragment. yokogumo no sora, dot, dot, dot. Okay. It gives a sense of incompletion, of interruption, but it also leaves room for growth and imagination. If you've read the classic work, The Book of Tea by Okakura Tenshin, you might remember the memorable phrase in which he mentions Japan's, quote, worship of the imperfect, end quote. Imperfect means not just flawed, as in a cracked tea bowl that has been repaired or was misshapen to begin with, but it also means to be incomplete. Like the grammatical structure of this poem is imagistically and conceptually incomplete. It leaves something for you, the reader, to imagine and project upon it. And that, to me, is one of the things that great art does. Our next poem was featured in an image used to publicize this talk. You'll also see it on the cover of your program. It's a fragment from a larger scroll, part of which the back half is owned by the Seattle Asian Art Museum. And it depicts paintings of deer interspersed with poems on autumn from the Shinko Kinshu, including this one. Miwataseba hana mo momiji mo nakarikeri, ura no tomaya no aki no yugure. As I look out, there are no blossoms, no crimson leaves, a thatched hut on the beach in the autumn twilight. This is another seasonal poem. The Japanese poets did not write nature poetry. They wrote seasonal poetry. And they were, as I said earlier, especially fond of spring and autumn. And you can see in the poetry, not just of Teika, but of others, really from the Kokinshu onward, an almost microscopic attention to the seasons, their changes and their shifts that can be found, I think, in Japan to this day, in the way people eat, dress, and speak. In fact, it's been argued that traditionally Japan doesn't have 4 seasons. It has 72 seasons. It's obvious that this poem is set in autumn at the time when day fades into night. We're at the seashore, and we're looking at the landscape through the speaker's eyes. The first half of the poem presents an enigma that has actually been puzzling readers for a few centuries. By the last line, we know that the season is autumn, and it would be natural maybe not to see the colored leaves of the maple trees at the beach. Typically the beach has these twisted pine trees. But why would you be surprised by there not being blossoms in autumn? In classical Japanese poetry, the word hana, or blossom, if it's otherwise unmarked, it means sakura, or cherry blossoms. And cherry blossoms bloom in the springtime. So why would you remark on their absence in autumn? This enigma is actually a clue that helps us read the poem. The speaker looks out and realizes, I'm not seeing cherry blossoms, I'm not seeing crimson leaves. And the realization is prompted by a feeling that's usually associated with seeing these beautiful things. They're actually symbolic, the glories of nature, spring and autumn, respectively. They're symbols and they're stand-ins. The speaker is getting that same feeling. And through the speaker's eyes, we see this little hut made out of thatch. And it's probably for people who make their living, very humble living, to eke out of the sea, whether through fishing, or diving for pearls, or collecting shellfish, or making salt, or gathering seaweed. And what should be a kind of eyesore at this particular place, at this particular time of day, in this particular season, then acquires a dignity and a beauty that surprise the speaker and ourselves. With just the right gradient of light and a chilly autumn breeze blowing the scent of the sea, the hut is elevated into something sublime. Those of you who are familiar with the Japanese tea ceremony may know this poem, or at least the sensibility that it encapsulates. Followers of wabicha, the austere style of tea that was pioneered by Senno Rikyu in the late 16th century, discovered this poem by Teika, and they held to it and took it as both an expression and a legitimation of their view that beauty and dignity were to be found not only amid luxury, excess, and grandeur, but also among humility, bare sufficiency, and frugality. This is a poem that both represented and nudged along a grand shift in traditional Japanese aesthetics. And last poem I'd like to read with you is not a seasonal poem, but it's a love poem that happens to be set in autumn. Teika was especially revered for later generations for his ability to write love poems. He shows, to my mind, an amazing knack for entering deeply into the mind of a lover. And he writes not just about yearning, joy, and the inevitable disappointment, but a variety of unnameable and unspeakable emotions in between. And here we have the poem in Teika's own handwriting from the autographed version of his collected poems, Shiri Guso. It's also a Japanese national treasure. So when we speak about Teika's poems, this is what we're speaking about. Everything else that comes from it is a derivative product. Like this. The poem in Romanized Japanese, in typeset Japanese, and in English translation. Toshimo henu, inoru chigiri wa hatsuseyama, onoe no kane no yoso no yugure. Years have passed, and the love I once prayed for is lost. On Mount Hatsuse, the bell rings at dusk for someone else. The bell and the mountain tell us that the scene is the Buddhist temple, Hasedera, on Mount Hase. In antiquity, they called it Mount Hatsuse, and it's located in present-day Nara Prefecture. At the temple, the central object of veneration is a statue of the Bodhisattva Kannon with 11 faces, and people would make a pilgrimage and pray to Kannon for various things that they wanted and needed. The first line of this poem is very simple. The years have passed. Passed since when? And what has happened since then? Chigiri means a vow or a pledge, and by tradition, a pledge between lovers to continue their relationship, and by extension, that relationship itself. Inoru chigiri, therefore, is the love that the speaker once prayed for years ago. And that prayer was granted, but the fruit of that prayer, the pledge or relationship, is now gone. The dusk tells us that the season is autumn. We have dusk, of course, in every season, but when it's unmarked, it's associated with autumn. Dusk is a time for the monks to ring the bell, but it's also a time for lovers to meet under the cover of darkness. And the speaker laments that the dusk belongs to someone else. All of this understanding is compressed and encoded into 31 syllables. If you're familiar with haiku, you've experienced something similar, because the reader has to bring a great deal of knowledge and understanding to the poem in order to unpack it. And that's made necessary by the inherent brevity of the form. And it also makes possible that brevity. In my view, Teika was doing something similar, but he didn't have 17 syllables. He had 31 syllables that he managed to pack an entire world. The form didn't demand that kind of density. You could be somewhat verbose even with 31 syllables, but he sought it out and he invested his poems with it anyway. And fundamentally, I think this is what distinguishes his poems from those of his peers and those of people who wrote before him and everybody who wrote since. So now we've seen a little bit of what Teika wrote, and it's fun to look at what other people have written about him. And they've been writing about him for the past 800 years, beginning with Godot, who in Exile wrote a treatise about poetry and spent half of it talking about Teika, and how Teika thinks so highly of himself and doesn't think well of anybody else, and how Teika's style has problems. He was almost obsessed with Teika. Let's look at how Teika was received from the medieval period onward. About 250 years after Teika died, a playwright decided to write a no play about him, in which, like Godot in Waiting for Godot, he never appears on stage. The no drama reached its pinnacle in the 14th and 15th centuries, and it's very well known for its stately and subtle style of performance, its simple, but at the same time exquisite staging and costumes, its avoidance of realism, its elusive and otherworldly libretti, and its use of masks, like you see here, which are themselves regarded as works of art. No has the oldest unbroken tradition in the history of theater and has been performed continuously for over 600 years. This play, which is now called Teika, but was originally called the Teika Vine, Teika Kazura, is set in Kyoto amid the sudden chilly showers of early winter, Shigure. And there are some Buddhist monks who are traveling. They come to visit the capital, and it starts to rain all of a sudden, and they seek shelter in the pavilion. And a mysterious woman appears and talks to them. And she tells them that the pavilion once belonged to the famous poet Teika, and he built it so that he could sit under the shelter of it and look out at the rains falling. She then recites an unusual story about Teika and the imperial princess Shokushi, herself a fine poet and a student of Teika's father Shunzei. Legend has it that the two engaged in an illicit affair, and Shokushi died soon after. Teika's attachment to her turned into a vine that wrapped around her grave, which just happens to be nearby, preventing her from attaining enlightenment in the afterlife. And here's a short clip. I'll show it to you here. It says, in English it says, her secret liaison with Lord Teika was not a shallow one. Afterwards, Princess Shokushi soon passed away, and Teika's attachment to her became a vine that wrapped around her grave. Neither one could escape their torment. The actor Asami Masakuni, a very fine actor, and I've seen him perform this play. I'm not sure it was this performance, but he's very fond of it, and he did an amazing job. In the second act, toward the end, the woman reveals that she, of course, is the ghost of Princess Shokushi, and she begs the monk for help in releasing her from the clutches of the twisting vines. You saw them at the top of the stage prop there. She comes back, that was the end of the first act. In the second act, she comes back very clearly as the princess, but the princess who's suffering in the afterlife. She puts on a different mask. It's got this very otherworldly look. For just a moment, she appears to enjoy liberation, and she begins to perform a dance of gratitude for the monks who have saved her. But before their eyes and ours, her face and her figure decay, and the play ends with the Teika vines reasserting themselves and claiming her body and soul once more. And that's what happens in the next clip. The line is simply, her impermanent figure is buried by the Teika vines and disappears. Teika and Princess Shokushi knew each other in real life, but there is no factual basis to suggest that they were lovers, and this seems to be a story that was invented out of whole cloth by the playwright. The Teika vine, however, is very real, and it seems to have gotten its name actually from this play. It had a different name, Asaki no Kazura, before that. It's called Asiatic Jasmine in English. It smells very nice, but you can see it just taking over this field. One of the most famous things that Teika is known for is compiling this little anthology of waka poems called Hyakunin Isshu, or 100 poems by 100 poets. In fact, Hyakunin Isshu is actually more famous than Teika. If you Google both of them, you'll get about 400,000 hits for Teika and 3.5 million for Hyakunin Isshu. It's actually probably the most famous collection of Japanese poetry, and probably known very well to people, more so than the Manyoshu, more so than the Kokinshu. And I understand that there's a Chihayaburu, there's an anime or a manga that's actually devoted to the world of Hyakunin Isshu. Hyakunin Isshu forms the basis for a card game. It's a kind of memory game in which these 100 poems, the second half of the poem is written or printed on a card, and the cards are laid out between two people. You can even play with more people, and somebody else reads the poem off the reading cards. If you don't know the poems very well, you just run around hunting. You wait for the person to get to the end of to get to the second half of the poem, and you just sort of look for it. But if you're really good at it, the way these people are, they're playing in a tournament at Macon University. In some cases, you can hear one syllable, and you know exactly which card to touch, and they'll just flick it away, and it goes flying. So that's why it's so popular. And people say that it was compiled by Teika. The original basis for saying that Teika compiled Hyakunin Isshu was just tradition. People said he compiled it, so they believed it. There was a text, a bunch of poems. People said, Teika picked these poems. There was no evidence. All of the poems are from imperial anthologies of waka. Actually, a couple of them are from anthologies that were compiled after Teika died. So anybody could have picked these poems. In the 17th century, however, people were believing this for a few centuries, and then they discovered in Teika's diary an entry that seemed to describe the making of Hyakunin Isshu. And that was cited as firm evidence that he compiled it. He talks about selecting and writing out poem cards, or shikishi, about 8 or 9 inches square, and they would be used to decorate the sliding doors of the villa of his neighbor. His neighbor Yoritsuna was a retired general, and Yoritsuna's daughter was married to Teika's son, so they were related by marriage. You see them here. It's also the case that in various museums and private collections in Japan, there are these poem cards called shikishi, and they do contain poems from Hyakunin Isshu, and the handwriting, as you can tell, looks a lot like Teika's. You can see how clear it is, how the characters are separate, and you can see the great variation in the thickness of the line. And these so-called ogura shikishi were said to be the ones that were pasted on the wall of Teika's neighbor in Saga, which is in the western suburbs of Kyoto. This happens to be from the Tokugawa Museum in Nagoya. But I have some bad news for you. The ogura shikishi are highly suspect. There are many of them, and no two have the same paper. They don't look like a set at all. And some of the poems were actually written on the back of used paper. If you look at this one here, between counting from the left, the first and second line, you can see the faint outline of some ink. This was written on recycled paper. Would Teika really have presented his son's father-in-law with something that he wrote on recycled paper? I don't think so. We've heard a lot about national treasures today. None of the ogura shikishi has been designated a national treasure or an important cultural property. In fact, the eminent scholar Katagiri Yoichi said that in his view, they were all fakes, ganbutsu. And there is actually no trace of them until the late 15th century. In fact, Teika died in 1241. The first document that we have mentioning the ogura shikishi is from 1490. Okay? That's 250 years after his death. And actually, it's a diary from a courtier who says that someone came by with Ogura Shikishi. He wanted me to write a slip to authenticate it. I thought it was fake, but I wrote the slip anyway. So the first time the Ogura Shikishi appeared in the extant record, it's a fake. Okay? I'm sorry to tell you that. Going back to Hyakunin issue itself, it also makes a rather late appearance. The earliest text of Hyakunin issue is actually from 1406. That's more than 150 years after Teika died. And remember, this is a family that kept documents. We still have we have Teika's diary in the original, we have his poems in the original, the Reizei-kei, his descendants, they were expert at holding on to things. But for some reason, this doesn't pop up, okay? And it doesn't come from the Reizei family either. It's actually associated with the Nijo line. Teika's grandsons, Tameuji, Tamesuke, and Tamekanu, all formed their own poetic houses, and they engaged in a bitter rivalry. They had a dispute over property, which included not just land rights, but Teika's papers. They were fighting over the Meigetsuki itself, and they had a lawsuit that lasted almost 100 years. Eventually, the Reizei family won the lawsuit, but they also outlived and outlasted the other branches. And so the text of this Hyakunin issue show doesn't say that the Shikishi were from Yoritsune's house. It says they were at Teika's house. It was very strange. And it's very defensive. It anticipates. People would say, why are we just hearing about these now? And so it's got a story about why it appeared late. Teika had to hide them. He didn't want people to see these poems that he collected. It also carries, at the very end, it says, this 100-poem sequence is the bones and eyes of the Nijo school. Okay? It's a kind of manifesto saying this is the essence of what we teach in our school, not the Reizei, not the Kyogoku. The Nijo actually advocated a simpler poetic style than the one that Teika practiced in the age of the Shinko Kinshu. In fact, the first poem I read to you about the spring night and the floating bridge of dreams, there's a Nijo house treatise that says, this is gobbledygook, it's nonsense, it doesn't make sense. Don't write this way. Okay? It's one of the greatest poems ever. They say, don't write this way. And so I also think it's no coincidence that the poems from Hyakunin issue are actually relatively simple and they're easy to memorize. This is the kind of style that they were advocating. So they collected these poems together from imperial anthologies and they put Teika's name on it to claim legitimacy for it. Hyakunin issue, in my view, was compiled long after Teika's death by someone affiliated with the Nijo school who attached his name to it in order to enhance their legitimacy. It might also have been created just to authenticate the Ogura Shikishi in order to sell them to collectors. I think I brought you down far enough. We had that gloomy play, first of all, and then I told you that Hyakunin issue is a forgery. So I'd like to end on a lighter note, and we'll look at some contemporary tributes to Teika. This looks again like Teika's handwriting. It's not. It's a font developed by the Adobe Corporation. Yoko Nishizuka. It's called Kazuraki, and it's designed to look like Teika's handwriting. Kazuraki is actually, the poem that's quoted here is actually appears in a no play. So they're not just referring to Teika, but they're actually referring to that play. It's a wonderful font. And one of the great things about it, if you look at this slip that I've given you on the left, you can read Japanese. Koto is linked, there's a ligature. Those are two separate characters. And they found a way to use the technology to actually make them link together, which is what you would do if you were writing by hand. It's quite difficult to do, but they solved it at last. And so I love this font. The target market for a font like this, as far as I can tell, if you read more samples, there's lots of menus. The target market appears to be fine Japanese restaurants. Serving what I feel to be is the greatest cuisine in the world, known as kaiseki ryori. This is the kind of food, again, you might be served at a formal tea ceremony. And so if they didn't have the time, they should really be writing out their menus by hand. That's the way to do it. But if they don't have the time for that, they don't have the budget for that, maybe they can print them out using the Teika font. As it so happens, in Hyogo Prefecture, which is our sister state in Japan, Washington's sister state, There's a restaurant called Megetsuki Restaurant, believe it or not. It's named after his diary. In fact, even their marketing taglines, you can't see them well, Shingi, Ushi, are actually closely associated with Teika. And you can tell by now that they're copying his handwriting style. They're not using the Adobe font. They did it another way. This restaurant is not too far actually from the Takarazuka Theater. So you can go there for lunch, and then after that, go see a matinee of Guys and Dolls or West Side Story performed by an all-female cast. This is the end, folks. My topic tonight was Teika's life and poetry, and I don't really have much of a conclusion because it's very difficult to sum up 80 years of life and 4,500 poems in a few sentences. Life defies conclusion. But I was asked to make my talk relevant to the contemporary world in some way, and I'll try to do that. We live in a world that is becoming less real and actual and more virtual every day through digital communication, video games, and so-called virtual reality. Actually, however, we have always been stepping in and out of virtual worlds through television, movies, and radio. And before that, we had the theater and its simpler technology of staged props, costuming, and makeup. And we've all been endowed with a natural form of virtual reality called dreaming. We're hardwired for it already. Reading is also a form of virtual reality. It allows us to immerse ourselves into another world and even into the thoughts and feelings of another person. Writing allows us to go even more deeply. Teika didn't just write love poems from the point of view of a male speaker. He wrote poems from a woman's point of view also. For example, as she waits, burning with desire for a lover who never arrives at her door. It's been said that we spend a great deal of our lives in virtual worlds inside our brain, looking at our phones. In fact, we do so every time we plan for the future or recollect the past. It's pointless, I think, to resist the virtual, but we would do well instead to consider the depth and the quality of the virtual experiences we are constructing for ourselves. I've spent a good portion of the last 20 years or so, really, immersed in Teika's world, and I hope now, this evening, you can see why. Go seichou arigatou gozaimasu. Thank you very much.